Clara to give some remarks and lead us into the rest of the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. So as Greg mentioned, I've been here in LA since about August as a visiting fellow and on my sabbatical year. I graduated from UC Santa Barbara with my PhD in 2011 and spent some time at UCLA as a postdoc immediately following. And it's been really a great pleasure to be back and spending time in such a vibrant research community. Wish it wasn't quite so rainy this winter, but we've had a great time. And I'm really thrilled to be asked to moderate the session today. As Greg mentioned, I've been working on issues related to urban climate governance and policy for a while. It's often been focused on both mitigation and questions of adaptation. Heat's a relatively new subject for me, but a lot of my work has focused on, specifically questions around the policies and strategies that can help ensure that urban adaptation measures are just and equitable, and not only, we not only avoid further marginalizing, further disinvesting in the communities that we know are struggling, that we know are vulnerable, but that we're actually developing adaptation strategies that put people on a better path and a stronger position. So as Greg also mentioned, some of this work has involved a case study of Los Angeles. I was thinking back, I think it was actually probably 6 or 7 years ago that I was here doing those interviews. And so some of my reflections back on that work at the time, I'll be curious to hear how much that might resonate still or not. I know things have evolved quite a bit. So when I was thinking about this panel, then I was trying to think about some of the themes specific to the issues of equity and adaptation and where university and city partnerships fit or might be best positioned in that kind of work. And a few themes that came to mind from my research, from my experience partnering with cities on these issues. There are 3 themes that came up for me that I thought might be useful as even just kind of fodder for thinking as we kind of kick off this really excellent panel. But those 3 themes for me, the first was issues of capacity. So one of my first times looking at climate adaptation policy was in the city of Delhi. And one of the things I came away thinking was that a lot of the efforts at that time, this was 10, 12 years ago, were around centering justice in their adaptation work. And there were a lot of challenges to doing that, but one was certainly the capacity of the city government. And while Delhi faces its own unique challenges, I think I've really seen that theme carry through in a lot of subsequent work with cities, about cities. That if we think of justice-centered adaptation as being a relatively new task that city governments are asked to take on, that city governments are voluntarily taking on, there's a lot of capacity that needs to be built to make that successful, right? Whether it's technical capacity, data, subject matter expertise. I think that can be a really important source of productive collaboration between cities and universities in building that capacity gap. And I'll also say that can also translate to community capacity as well. One thing I've been doing with the city of Ann Arbor is helping with their climate ambassador training, where they bring residents together to be kind of educating them as kind of new grass tops advocates out in the community. And so we'll have training sessions with them. It's been a really effective program. The other thing that came to mind is this idea of that cities are often learning on the fly, or as one city official in Toronto said once, we're building the plane as we're flying the plane kind of idea. And this was, again, probably 6 or 7 years ago, but I think is still, because cities are on the front line of climate governance, I think it's just still one of these things we have to constantly be grappling with. And that's, again, where I think universities can be a trusted resource, thinking about metrics of success, strategies for scaling up, Sometimes universities need to be able to keep up with that kind of dynamic. Might be a stretch goal for universities sometimes, but I think again can be a really great source of collaboration. And the third thing that I thought of was the need to really build coalitions to make this kind of work successful. And I do think that's another way that university partnerships can help and support. And was something that has stood out to me at times when I look at Los Angeles, or when I've done interviews with folks working in Los Angeles, where a lot of the successful environmental strategies, climate strategies have really come out of really broad-based coalitions, whether it's passing new tax measures, building political support for energy retrofits, that, this cross-sectoral, cross-jurisdictional coalitions are really central to doing this kind of work. And I think universities can play a role in making those connections and helping navigate some of those spaces. So with that, I will now encourage us to turn to our really, really excellent panel. I'm really excited to hear from everyone today. And the way we're going to set this up, we'll start out by asking each panelist a question. We'll have about 6 or 7 minutes to answer that question. Then we'll open it up to the panel as a whole, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So that's kind of what to expect for the next little bit. So let's start with Marta Segura, if you're willing. So Marta, the question I'm going to pose to you is, how can researchers, including at UCLA, better support city active heat equity planning efforts like yours? Pretty broad, pretty open. We want to hear from you badly.
Well, first I want to say thank you so much for inviting me and for all of the amazing support I've received from so many folks here. Great peers, the students, the MPP students that are also here. I think we actually took on more than we could normally handle from UCLA this year, but it was such a rewarding experience and very eye-opening. And I definitely recommend it to anybody considering, because we need dynamic new ideas at city level, and the inspiration that we receive from the thought process, the approach, the questions that were gathered by the students and their methodology, their approaches impress, not just people at the city, but I was sharing with people at the state that have looked at some of the data and information that we have been receiving from our UCLA students. So it's a super welcome partnership, and I look forward to continuing. So I want to start with the gratitude. And maybe a little bit of context. My office is relatively new at the city of Los Angeles, been there 2 years, 1 year as chief heat officer. So I have really a triple role. I usually say dual role. I'm a chief heat officer, the director of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, and also the executive director of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Commission. And why I mention that is because we're also talking about governance, right? And the reason the commission was created was to give folks from these environmental justice communities, not just a seat at the table, but an opportunity to review proposed climate policy through an equity lens before it actually went to the city council. And we did that last year with building decarbonization policy, and it really changed the language of the building decarbonization policy and ensured that we delayed the existing building decarb policy to the future to ensure that we had an equity focus, considered tenant rights, considered displacement, considered how expensive the retrofits are that we need, sustainable funding sources, and we needed to ensure we had some really good pilots, some really good information and data to make sure we're not creating with our regulations any more displacement and any more homelessness. And definitely under this mayor, that is an absolute priority. So it really aligned not with just the previous administration's view of equity, but the current administration's prioritization of preventing homelessness. So we have to, really take into consideration potentially unintended consequences of not just climate policy, energy policy, and really any policy at the city of LA. So the other thing that we have at the city of LA is this thing called the equity index. equity index was created in the previous administration, but it didn't have a real strong climate focus or even climate equity focus. So we're working to, as a voice of the Angelinos, bringing the voices of the research project, we're bringing that information to the chief administrator's office because they're the holders of this equity index. And that equity index serves as a measurement for all the general managers across the city of Los Angeles to measure the success of the application of their budget, right? So it's a really important tool that I hope we continue to evolve and improve upon. It does include CalEnviro screen, but there's a lot of data there that's missing to make it much more customized to the city of Los Angeles. I don't know how much more time I have, but investing in infrastructure and redesigning of the city, especially putting a focus on the communities that have been historically disinvested, is another area that we advocate for in the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office. And you see that reflected on our Climate Equity LA series. I think you see it reflected in the research that all of the UCLA students are doing. And I won't get into the research the students are doing because they're going to do that. But I will say that because we're at the precipice of beginning our climate vulnerability assessment at the city of Los Angeles, also the heat action plan, also the local hazard mitigation plan, this information that the UCLA researchers are bringing to us is going to be part of the consideration in the development of those plans. And so that we can ensure to, reflect the deeper equity needs that were recognized by the UCLA researchers. So I think timing couldn't have been more perfect. On the other hand, these are also plans that will have multiple phases. So there will be other opportunities to include the results and the research of UCLA, and I'm looking forward to those collaborations in the future. So I like to see all these documents as living documents, the ones that I just mentioned. I want to make sure that they're always interactive and reflective of the voices that are coming together to create them. And again, to make them more equitable to avoid these historical and intended consequences of the policies that we have. And then the last thing that I'll say, because I think a couple of you here might be working on your own heat action plans, is that there is a network of plans at every city. We have all these plans that I just mentioned and about 100 others. We have to identify in this climate vulnerability assessment which of these plans are relevant to the climate vulnerability assessment. How can we make those plans, existing plans, maximize our resources and minimize our efforts so that we can get to the intended goals and make this a much more equitable plan. And I think the final thing that I'll share is that all of you probably already know this, but it's my belief that in focusing on equitable climate solutions and investing first and foremost in the historically disinvested communities, we will accelerate climate solutions for everyone. Because if we don't reduce emissions there, we don't reduce emissions for anyone. And if we don't bring in nature-based solutions there, redesign there, climate adaptation tools there, it's going to slow the whole process down. And what's happened in the past is that we have really tried to put the burden on the early adopters. And the early adopters can afford to do it. And I thank them for making those attempts in the past. But this shouldn't just be a market-driven effort. It should be an equitable, multi-stakeholder, governmental-driven effort where we put the voices of the community at the forefront, and those voices are reflected in the policies.
Great. Thank you so much. It's great. I really love your point about universities being a source of new ideas and innovation too. I think that's probably exciting for a lot of us. And I appreciate your point too about the mayoral agenda on housing and homelessness of, influencing the way you go about your work and just how embedded, this adaptation work is in larger policy goals and how much those larger policy goals really matter. So thank you so much. Next, we're gonna switch to Miguel and Michelle Gallarza, and I'll pose the same question to you both and give you time to answer independently. But the question is, how does your lived experience of urban heat and other climate impacts inform your research with the city? In particularly if you want to highlight your urban planning group project with CMO and how you've seen those two things intersect and interplay as you work with the city.
So for me, working as a researcher, not only with CMO capstone project, but working with the Luskin Center on the policy briefs that we published on housing and extreme heat and climate extreme heat has all been informed by my own lived experience with extreme heat. So I grew up here in UCLA in the Napa Valley, and for folks who may not know, it's extremely hot there, especially during the summer. And when I was growing up, we didn't have air conditioning in my home. And when I was in first grade, I was actually on a year-round system, so I had to go to school during the summer, and we didn't have air conditioning at school. And so basically what my experience was like was at school, we had class with no lights on and just fans blowing because it was so hot. And the same thing would happen when I would go home at night. We would just have fans blowing, no lights on to kind of like feel like it was getting cooler with, out air conditioning or anything. So living through that experience and recognizing being in a predominantly community with color, there are a lot of equities embedded across housing, schools, the built environment in general. And even today, my mom currently lives in Sylmar. She lives in a mobile home. She's an elderly person who doesn't have air conditioning or insulation in her home. And visiting her on really hot days, it's hotter inside than it is outside. It is literally unbearable. But she, I suppose, has a tolerance for that at this point because folks living in environments do build tolerance to that. But it's just, that really like colors my view when I come into this work with the CMO capstone project and the prior research that I've done, because you see how it impacts me. You see how it impacts your daily life. And so being here is really like a moment for me in that way. And so when it comes to approaching research, I do think about it very intersectionally, because I think what's important to consider is that we are talking about folks who don't have resources, and those are structural issues. And people may not be thinking about extreme heat on a daily basis because it might just be during the summer or it might be during a specific heat wave. And so that's where we need research and we need policy to make sure that the infrastructure is in place so that people don't have to contend with it when it's likely to wait, because people are focused on paying rent, they're focused on taking care of their families. Maybe like installing AC isn't the first thing that comes to mind. So we have to think about it very intersectionally, especially considering how much wealth and income inequality exists in the city of LA. And another really big point that I want to touch on is housing insecurity. And this is something that I was able to research in the policy brief that I worked on with the Luskin Center, is when it comes to housing insecurity and folks living in rental units that are not adapted for weatherization, for food, they probably are also struggling to pay the rent and can be maybe 1 month away, 1 or 2 months away from being evicted. And when folks are evicted, where do they end up? They can become unhoused. And what we know is that unhoused folks are more likely to suffer from the extreme effects of heat, such as being, vulnerable in the streets or not having access to cooling. And that can really increase folks' likelihood for illness and unfortunately even death. And this is something that we've looked on in our own research with the CMO project, is that in LA County last year, 42% of heat-related deaths in 2022 were unhoused folks in the county, but they only make up less than 0.01% of the population. So we know that unhoused folks and folks who are housing insecure face the most dangerous risks and consequences of extreme heat. And I think that's where we really have to lean in more in understanding how climate and housing are intersectional issues. And so I'm personally on the cooling center subgroup for the capstone project with CMO. And so we're really looking at how cooling centers are kind of a measure to help folks who don't have access to home cooling or are unhoused,
rely on public resources in order to protect themselves during heat waves. However, what we have also seen, unfortunately, is that a lot of these public viewing centers are not always welcoming for unhoused people as well. And we actually conducted a research with a local unhoused advocate who kind of like told us about these experiences of going to libraries and being kicked out, or maybe taking a nap because it was hot and they were trying to recover and being forced out of the library or not being able to bring their belongings inside. And so I think this is why, for me, it's a very intersectional issue, because when we're talking about those vulnerable people, we are talking about folks who are highly stigmatized in our society. And what this person, Theo Henderson from ABN House, which is a local advocacy organization, had suggested is thinking outside of the box. And so right now, what we have are stationary cooling centers that are city owned and operated, but what we need are actual mobile cooling centers that can bring resources to unhoused people without forcing them to go somewhere where they might be criminalized or kicked out. And so those are some of the reflections that I've had working on this project, and I think really pushing us to think about policy making from lived experience and understanding what the barriers are to protecting people where they're at, and really bringing in the resources and mobilizing folks to, identify where the problems are that people are facing in their everyday lives and really direct resources.
That was good.
Yeah, I'm gonna echo a few things that Michelle said. I mean, we've had some, shared experiences. I still live in a mobile home and a manufactured home community. And I also live in the San Fernando Valley, and I always have my entire life. It's really hot. It becomes one of those things that it really does get unbearable. And summer comes and you try to prepare for it. You try to buy as much water as you can. You try to prepare your AC bills. And I have family members and friends who actually have to put away savings, right, to pay for electricity bills because they know their AC is going to be running on a daily basis. And sometimes you don't think about how much financial pressure that places on specific communities that aren't well adapted to take on like these extreme heat events. And even for us, like I think it really came to the forefront during the middle of the pandemic where, manufactured homes for a while, we were very worried about what the infrastructure was going to look like. Will our water bills be would our water utilities be turned off during times of extreme heat? Like all these different types of insecurities that you don't think about. And as a student researcher, I think your mind races onto so many things. Like you start thinking then about like these lived experience on affordability, on infrastructure, on heat, on actual emotional experiences and social connections that these communities establish, and resiliency, and how much of that do we include in our research, I think becomes a very big like game of you tossing it up in the air on like, well, I want to consider my parents or my uncle or my aunt that, need ready to go actions right now. They're suffering right now. But I also know that on the academic side, you need to show the advocacy first, right? I think it always becomes this, like, how much of it am I repeating the data over and over to harp on the same issue and show that like these communities are in fact experiencing a lot more extreme heat, and not just manufactured homes, but we identified specific areas in the city of LA that, have been experiencing for years now prolonged heat exposure. And some of that stems, from different historical standpoints. But I think it becomes very difficult to balance that a little bit. And I think also like when you are trying to do research, like what we're doing right now with CMO, again, you find yourself in this rabbit hole, and like we're concentrating, or at least my group is concentrating on understanding where transit shelters are supposed to be placed in the city of Los Angeles. And, the easy answer is always, well, everywhere, right? Because I think everyone should be able to use a transit shelter and have some protection from inclement weather. But also that can't financially be the case. Like there's sometimes some difficulties that get presented on how we take action on some of these things that we're finding. We know the problem, but the connection on how do we get to the solution becomes a lot more difficult. And especially for someone like me who's lived through those experiences and is like ready for those solutions to come, you really start to actively think like, well, how can we really incorporate the people that are using these resources and need them right now? And CMO, thankfully, I think is a first step to really introduce something that I've worked on neighborhood councils before. I've worked at the public sector before, and sometimes having those conversations is really difficult to have if you don't have a platform like CMO. And I think that is the first step to at least getting some advocacy and community advocacy to really explain like what those lived experiences are. One thing is reading about them, but as you're hearing my own stories and what I'm saying, right, it impacts it a little bit differently. And I think when we can introduce those voices at the actual planning circles where we're deciding what can go on and what happens and what solutions can be created, I think that is the first step. Especially for if I had the ability to bring my mom, who is right now paying upwards to like $200 to have like little teeny AC running just to have a small unit cool down for half of the day, it makes a big difference. And I think sometimes I just recently had a question like planners, we always want to include the community, but how do we do it? It becomes a harder question once we start really thinking about, well, how can we do it? How can we do it effectively? How can we do it without stepping on other people's toes? But I think, organizations like CMO and departments like CMO that are really trying to bring people in and actually listen to what we have to say is a big step and something that we've never had on our side. And I'm grateful for it. So I hope that, we continue to listen to these voices and these lived experiences because they have insights on what they've already done versus us having to repeat the needle again.
Thank you. Yeah, great. And just really appreciating hearing your experiences and suggestions. And it makes me think too that this is something you were talking about, universities being sources of ideas. And this is another, I think, really important way that another type of idea or source of ideas that universities should be thinking about when they think about what they can offer to cities in the policy planning process and really help to support and elevate the students that can provide those. It's excellent. Can't wait to see the results of your project too. Okay, so let's go to CJ now. And CJ, you've been working on similar issues in other parts of the state, other communities. And so question I was going to ask you is, how does what you're hearing about the relationship between researchers and the city of LA on heat issues compare to your experiences in your work, and how can we make sure to center heat adaptations for households with uncooled housing and the unhoused in particular?
Thanks. Yeah, thank you all so much for coming and to the Luskin Center for organizing this. I was kind of reflecting on how much heat has become an issue that planners and other related disciplines have been thinking about in just an incredibly, more meaningful way in the last few years. And reflecting on, I was here finishing a PhD in 2016, and I mean, I don't think heat was really a topic of conversation. And then, we're packing rooms with people thinking about it, about all of this local government effort and all of these amazing university student-led projects. And so I just want to kind of recognize how much, how far we've come. And then also just all of these issues that are raised, like we have a lot more to do in terms of researchers to understand how we can better meet the needs of people who are currently suffering from heat. So I want to talk, maybe just touch on a few different projects that I think have a lot of overlap with what you all were saying before, and just all of these comments just really resonated with me. The first piece was a project that Greg Pierce and I worked on, where we were trying to understand what are California cities doing about heat, and what are the kind of opportunities and barriers in those realms. And it seems like there are some real commonalities across cities, and we found that cities are acknowledging heat as an issue in their plans. Many or most cities have a set of kind of urban greening strategies, including urban forestry programs or removing impervious surfaces and replacing it with some kind of vegetative surfaces. Also, green roof programs are quite common. But most cities don't really have much data or maps or focus on like the details of vulnerability. And so we identified some gaps in terms of, opportunities to identify inequities by race and income and the spatial variation in heat exposure. And so this is, a huge opportunity area, and it's great to hear about, the role of university partnerships in creating these kinds of maps and working with city governments to create these kinds of maps. Also, there's a lot of challenges around implementation, and I think this gets to Sarah's point about capacity and also coordination. For large cities, we observed traditional silos between disciplines, but then in smaller cities, just the planner who is working on the heat plan is also staffing the cooling center, is also doing this, and just kind of this set of capacity issues. And so I think coordination and funding and figuring out how we can translate what we're learning in the heat realm into operational kind of strategies is going to be huge. So, this really resonates with me, everything that you all were saying. I wanted to share a little bit about, I'm so happy to be here this year and back in LA, and just seeing how much momentum is going on around heat in Southern California. And I've been more plugged into Northern California. I'm based in Santa Clara, which is near San Jose, in the Bay Area. And I wanted to share like two quick blurbs about projects that have involved students and have been working with either city or county governments there. But the first project was looking at, for housed populations, we were looking at kind of the variation in heat vulnerability and heat risk by housing type and by location in San Jose, and getting at these issues of air conditioning, just having air conditioning. We kind of just, data is such a huge challenge in these things. We weren't able to even get into the issues of being able to afford air conditioning, issues around, is it working or not? Are there other barriers? But just trying to understand who has air conditioning, who lives in areas that are hotter, and who lives in areas with less tree canopy, and going from there. And we found, huge set of disparities, probably, which, in some ways you'll probably think like, oh, I'm just kind of stating the obvious, but documenting it for the city and mapping it out has been really useful. And looking at this kind of intersection of heat and lack of shade and lack of air conditioning. And it tended to vary a lot by housing type. Single family owner occupied housing, least heat risk. They tended to have more air conditioning prevalence, more trees, slightly cooler areas, and then we get into the attached multifamily rental housing. And we saw that was a housing type in San Jose that tended to have the most heat risk, particularly older and rental housing were the least likely to have air conditioning, central air conditioning. And, this kind of combination of outdoor and indoor exposure is something that we have a lot more to learn about, but just starting to map it and work with local stakeholders in the city to try to understand, okay, these, studies help us to understand, like, we can target policies for multifamily renters, households, or the property owners. And then the issues around the unhoused. I'll just briefly mention this study that my colleague Jamie Chang and I have done in Santa Clara County, which includes San Jose. So we wanted to understand how unhoused residents in the county were experiencing heat, what their lived experiences were, how they were coping with it, and how policies could help ease the heat burden. And I really appreciate, Michelle, that statistic about 42%, because, I was going to say, in all of our kind of national looks, we've seen upwards of up to 50% of heat-related deaths being unhoused folks. So this is just a huge area if we're thinking about how do we improve heat health, looking at unhoused residents. And, we started by looking, okay, where are unhoused people living? What are some of the neighborhood characteristics of those neighborhoods? Where are kind of clusters of census tracts that are at the intersection of heat and lack of shade and unhoused residents? And we identified a few kind of corridors along the Guadalupe River, along Coyote Creek, and then in and around downtown San Jose. And then we interviewed 82 unsheltered, unhoused people in those areas to understand their lived experiences, and trying to understand why are unhoused folks in Santa Clara County ending up in hotter places. And essentially, just to kind of boil it all down to just 30 seconds or 45 seconds or something, it's that they were making trade-offs between stability and places where they weren't going to get swept or less likely to be swept, and places that were, less shaded, hotter. And so essentially these more stable locations ended up being places where they had worse access to water, worse access to basic services, and then also they tended to be, there tended to be less tree canopy too. And so, and then our second set of questions was looking at cooling centers, and sounds like there's a lot of overlap with what your team found too, in terms of why weren't more unhoused people going to cooling centers, and what we heard was that the cooling center, related issues had to do with information and knowing when they were operating, where they were, transportation issues. They weren't necessarily located that conveniently to people who were unhoused, and then the restrictive policies or exclusive policies that made it feel unwelcoming or deterred people from going back. So, I think trying to kind of boil it all down, I think for me, this all brings together this need for like mixed methods, community-based research that gets at quantifying things that we might be thinking are the obvious, but also really kind of documenting lived experiences and working with people who are affected by heat to try to shape policies. So love to, and I'd love to continue this discussion, hear questions, and then, maybe the last thing I'll say, since I have a couple of minutes, is I feel like I'm learning so much about heat through every one of these projects and learning new dimensions of it. And I think every time one of these projects ends up leading to like 5 more questions that we can't answer, or we don't have, any documentation about. And so I think just using these as a way to learn about how our communities are functioning, and a way to learn about, how we can leverage some of these heat issues into co-benefits in other areas related to health. And one particular one is air quality. And Santa Clara County now has heat and air quality working group, the County Public Health and Office of Sustainability. And so seeing kind of these opportunities for, multi-issue collaborations, I think this is very helpful. And just there's so much to do, but there's also so much going on. So
Yeah.
I want to end it on that.
Great. I'm glad you mentioned air quality, because it was something that I did forget to mention, that we find the areas with the greatest chronic illness with the highest rate of air pollution to actually suffer more from heat exposure than if it's just hot, right? If it's just hot and you don't have air pollution and you don't have chronic illness, you don't have as great an impact. So it's great that Santa Clara County is doing that now. And ironically, I'm from San Jose, California. And even more ironically, I was displaced. My whole entire neighborhood was demolished, and we were displaced from that Guadalupe River Parkway. So interesting. One of the reasons I never went back. And I guess that goes to the issue of historical disinvestment and the policies that were made that we're paying for now. We're actually trying to repair all the damage that has been done by policies that were created by policymakers that didn't have, the best interests of everyone at heart. And that's a really good example of displacement. And there's been various reasons throughout history why communities have been displaced, but we don't want this issue of creating healthier homes and creating healthier lives and bringing about climate solutions to be one of those reasons. And that's why it's so important that everybody is here today. And we know there is a better way to create climate solutions. And I'm going to say something that not a lot of people talk about in my area, but basically we have been ignoring the issue of air quality at the expense of just talking about carbon sequestration, carbon capture, reducing carbon. And that does ignore, the impacts of overall air quality. And what are we going to do? Start all over again? And now we're going to pick another chemical that's impacting us and just focus on that chemical for the next 10, 20 years. I really do think that as we're reducing the impact of carbon, we have to reduce the impact of all air pollution, or we're gonna keep on having this historical burden of not having enough funding to do all of the rebuilding, all of the redesigning, all of the investment that we need to have healthy, thriving communities. And I always say that the goal of every city and every government is to create healthy, safe, thriving communities. And if we create every decision based on, is this going to make this city healthier, this city thrive, this city actually equitable to repair those historical disinvestments, then, then we'll be on the right track. So that is super important, I think, to keep repeating, because a lot of people want to do good. So they'll come up with a technology, or they'll come up with an economic solution, and then it's good in its own and in theory, but in application, we have to have all of these other intersectional reasons and integrated planning, to ensure that it works out.
That's a great segue to just, we've heard so many good examples of, and just demand for, I would say, too, these great research and policy partnerships around heat. And just before we open it up, maybe I'll throw one quick question at all the panelists. And if you could say what you see as either one kind of partnership best practice or one partnership worst practice, or if you're really quick on the fly, one of each. So I think we're already kind of starting to get into that realm. CJ, you had some great examples, or talking about maybe some don'ts.
With the
But-
research here at UCLA best practice.
Yeah, we kind of going back to that collaboration space and those partnerships that are the most meaningful and most powerful between the city and the university. Whereas some of the really promising levers, practices, and what are the ones to avoid. And
Well, a great example, I think, is our work with MPP students. They had a division of labor. You had a project manager, or other titles, this distribution of labor amongst them, and who would be the contact, with the city. That really helped. And then I shared that with Professor Greg Pierce, and I think that model was replicated with the students as well. But I think that they need to have these groups of research groups need to have their own organizational structure to make sure communication runs smoothly amongst them, and then with the city. And the smoother that is for them, the smoother that is for the partnership. So I'd say that's something that works. I did realize that I took on more than I could probably chew, and I would have liked to have been there more for Professor Greg Pierce's students, and provided more information and more timely responses to what their needs were, but they did a phenomenal job based on the information and the timing that we had. So you guys did kick ass.
That's great. That's great.
Phenomenal. You hustled with the lack of access that you had with us in our office. But in the future, I would like to be able to provide even more access to the information that you need. And I do think it's important to have somebody with institutional experience. And even though I've been in and out of the city for 9 years, this was really at the end of my first year when I committed to Greg. So we were still building those relationships, say with the fire department or the emergency management department, and getting that information back to the students was, it was good for SEMO because we were building those relationships with departments we hadn't really established, but it slowed down how fast we can get that information. So I think we did it.
Yeah, keeps communication open. Yep, sure. That's great. What about Miguel and Michelle? Would you have advice you would pass down?
And it's okay to be critical.
No, I think part of it was, balancing also that SEMO is trying to build relationships with departments. I think that we understood as students. And then also considering our skills in social and emotional intelligence. I think that was something that we carry with us as a strength. In other words, understanding how we feel and how do we hold that compassion for the communities that we're actually analyzing. I think it becomes a really big strength that hopefully like continues to be built on, like what hopefully in the future we get an opportunity to really go and visit in partnership with CMO those communities physically, and communicate with those communities, because part of it, it builds our own skills on social and emotional intelligence, on understanding what they actually are going through, what people are actually experiencing, and just it takes it to another level that adds to our analysis a little bit more, that I think sometimes in these projects you're so rushed that you feel like you don't have time, but I think it can become a priority hopefully later on in the future.
I want to build on that, and I think it's incredibly important to have a qualitative research component that does aim to capture these experiences. But I do think as a research community, we should bring this further, and we should actually have researchers start from the community on these research teams, because folks in the community have the experience and perspective that you can't learn in a classroom. And I think that's incredibly valuable, and that should be sought after. And it's not always easy to come by that. So I think the next best thing is working with community organizations with your research projects and also co-authoring with them. And one great example I want to raise is Michael Mendez, who worked with 2 community organizations to author a report called The Invisible Victims of Disaster, where he essentially documented how undocumented immigrants and particularly indigenous migrant workers in the Ventura and Santa Barbara counties were impacted by wildfires. And so he was able to gain access by working with 2 community organizations to co-author the report with him. And I think that's the model that we should be looking for, like crediting them, helping to fund them, really bringing them into the research project. If we're talking about equity, then we have to ground ourselves in that practice, and we have to aim to do that.
It's hard to add too much to what you're saying, but I mean, I think maybe the only things I would add would be kind of finding this balance between something that's like a pressing need for the community partner, but also maybe something that's a little exploratory that they haven't had a chance to devote staff or volunteer resources for, and the students can run with it and find something, whether it's looking at best practices or using like a mixed methods approach to try to get at a problem that they might suspect is happening. That's one thing. But also to be realistic about the 1 quarter is not a ton of time for a community-based project. So this next year, actually in our capstone projects, we're going to be doing a quarter and a half. So I'll be really curious to see if a quarter and a half, 15 weeks makes a difference, or whether, you know, at the end of that, it still isn't enough time. We still, you know, bit off more than we could chew in a quarter. But, you know, I think just being, you know, realistic, I think is the best practice with what, you know, the student faculty community partner team can do in 10 weeks, or, you know, but I think I've seen teams do amazing things. So I think just, you know, going in with that mindset though, and making sure everyone is realistic about it, which sounds like you all have been as well, and got everything done, even if it came down to the wire.
Great. Thanks so much. That makes so much sense. And let's take the rest of our time now to open it up to questions. We've got just over 20 minutes. So hopefully we can get to a lot of folks.
I'd like to ask the whole panel, you know, as someone who's been driven from here to Texas and all the infrastructure from here to the desert recently, I've been in the Salton Sea. I've been out in Palm Springs where a mobile home park was built in the 50s, where the mobile home park, the people that have the mobile homes own the land underneath. But I think it's corruption that in the infrastructure is collapsed. That Gerald Palmer has gotten away with building the billionaire apartments right on top of the freeway. They should have been outlawed a long time ago. And the subsidy and the rollback of the subsidies for solar by the cronies who sit on the utilities commission, rolled back where people can't. I talk to people who have solar and they make their payments and they have a little extra afterward with their solar panels. But another thing is utilities got away with murder. Up in Northern California, I was living on Point Doom one time and the high winds blew the power lines down and from Point Doom all the way to Leo Carrillo, El Matador, it was in flames. And the last Malibu fire was caused by utility wires not being underground, blowing down and catching fire. What kind of insane society do we live in that lets this happen?
If anyone wants to tackle that.
That's really issue the CPUC, I'm sure, has taken up, and Governor Gavin Newsom has taken up, and I mean,
Because as we said, how much people get and sell it back to the utility.
right. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that,
Any other state, these people would have been held to criminal murder charges.
right.
They knew that they had to put these wires after years of fires. They had to put them in under, you go to rich gated communities, the utilities are underground.
So this is a, I guess what I'm trying to say is that's a state issue and we're a city. And
It's a whole
Well,
thing.
Maybe,
but we're with the,
Of why,
I can only comment on the Department of Water and Power, and even they are a proprietary agency in the city of LA. It's not that I disagree, it's just that I am not capable of commenting on.
we'll comment on why these apartments were built on top of a freeway.
I also wasn't at the city at that time.
yeah,
Okay, but why they're still being, I see brand new construction on the side of the freeways.
let's parking lot it for now. Let's parking lot it for now.
Where, let's rest of that.
Well, maybe another way to think about it outside of the specific question of the power lines might be, if we're trying to redirect infrastructure investment from status quo to a new model of infrastructure investment that targets other priorities, what does that look like if we're trying to move from one infrastructure investment regime to another, maybe?
Yeah, well, here's the thing, the planning department and the planning commission for the entire city makes decisions on developments that are, let me see if I can remember, that are over 50 units or more, right? However, members of the city council can overturn the decisions of the planning commission. So I think what's happened historically is that the planning commission attempts to make good, reasonable, integrated planning decisions for the entire city. But then you have certain council members, many of whom are no longer there, let me just say that, who have overturned those decisions. And and we have a city council that each council member is basically looked at as responsible for their city council. And what we really want as citizens is for the entire council to be responsible for the entire city, not give that power or authority to that one council member. And that's historically how this is run. So it really is up to then the public to call out that discrepancy and that incoherence of policy to ensure that that doesn't happen as a pattern in the future. But I do agree that, and we fought with Communities for a Better Environment. I used to be a statewide campaign director for Communities for a Better Environment, and we proposed the cleanup green up policy, which would have prevented buildings from being built next to freeways. It would have, it also proposed that refineries and oil wells had to disclose their presence and the emissions that they were creating. Now, not all of the aspects of that policy were passed, obviously. So be that as it may, I think it is a tug and pull. And that's again, going back to governance and the voices of those that are most impacted being part of our commission and them having the ability to speak loudly against policies that hurt everyday people in the city of Los Angeles.
Yeah, I think that's great. Elections really matter too. Did you have your hand up earlier? Yeah.
Yes, Sharon, Sam Trust for Public Land. As you have all done your work, curious if you've seen innovative or what kind of funding mechanisms you've seen, given that a lot of you said capacity is a huge issue?
What kind of funding have we seen that's innovative or
for
projects?
student needs?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, the state government is doing a really great job in trying to catch up to address extreme heat. They're funding those community resilience centers. They're funding, heat adaptation projects and infrastructure projects. But we haven't really seen the rollout from the federal government yet and how that's going to be implemented. So when I talk about models, like there's the camera model at DWP that's funding multifamily households and the retrofits of multifamily households to be decarbonized. But we're going to need many more of those to understand what are the different funding mechanisms that fund those projects besides DWP and besides the city of LA. Are there philanthropic sources? Are there federal sources? Tax credits? What creates the actual package that we need to retrofit those older buildings? And as you know, most of those older buildings need to be retrofitted, re-roofed, and that's the bigger expense even than bringing in solar panels and batteries. So we need to be more creative as a city and as a government to ensure that we see that as the obstacle. If we really want healthy homes, we're going to have to weatherize them. We're going to have to retrofit them. We're going to have to bring new roofing. And that's where the creativity of government and leaders like yourselves can help us write policy. So right now, the Department of Building and Safety at the City of LA is charged with creating that existing building decarbonization policy. You can make your advice known through me at our commission meetings or directly through DBS or DBS and ourselves, so that, we can make sure to integrate the solutions that you think we need for creating more equitable funding streams to actually retrofit these existing buildings, because as it stands now, it's going to take decades to decarbonize these existing buildings, and people shouldn't have to wait decades.
I might just add just two things. One, the Santa Clara County work is actually funded by a CDC grant. And so that's funded their public health and Office of Sustainability work around heat, and then the air quality and heat work. And then also, I mean, I think there are kind of some of these emerging state and to some degree federal sources like the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program from the state of California, which is been going on for I think around 6 or 7 years now, but looking at ways that heat is just one of the very small criteria as part of the funding of affordable housing and infrastructure projects through that, but kind of integrating heat as a criterion into like broader state funding. I believe it's called Clean California Grants. We'll have to double check that. But when we were talking with smaller jurisdictions, a number of them mentioned that that they were able to use Clean California grants for some projects that met multiple goals, like downtown revitalization, heat. So trying to think of kind of maybe trying to meet multiple objectives with some of these programs that, maybe heat's not the number one priority of these programs, but it's certainly a co-benefit that's acknowledged.
I think the last thing I'll say is that as we fund the green transition and redesign and reshaping cities and climate adaptation, it should just be a co-benefit that every building, transportation system, open spaces, our bioswales, reservoirs are all considering extreme heat. And that takes us back to the heat action plan and the climate vulnerability assessment, and ensuring that every city kind of aligns their sustainability, their vulnerability, their climate assessment, their heat action plan, because then you can maximize how you invest those resources into very similar planning, and you accomplish all those goals all at once versus looking at each plan separately, and then you'll never finish. You'll never accomplish all the goals. So it really speaks to unsiloing how cities work and operate, and having the openness of the various city leaders that run the departments, not just the council members, to have that flexibility and that patience. And so far at the city, I have received nothing but flexibility and patience. So I'm very hopeful we can accomplish that in our co-planning, co-benefits and co-planning for the redesign of our city and the redesign of our infrastructure. And then we can maximize the investments that we're getting from the federal government, state government, and actually accomplish some of these goals. And then that other wheel, right? Investing first and foremost in the historically disinvested communities, so you can begin to see the big changes first, rather than spreading it all out and not seeing the changes because it's just so spread out. We want to see that place-based model applied to how we do infrastructure investments, so we can see the transition visibly, and the people that are suffering the most can feel it. It's really important to acknowledge that this is an opportunity like no other in our lifetime, so that people get excited about alignment, people get excited about unsiloing and planning together. And realizing they can't just squander the money on things that have been status quo, since that won't get us very far.
I love that. I'm excited.
Thanks, everyone. I have a question for you, Mark. Activists in that part of the world. And Seguro for Change.
All right.
I'd actually, what was the lessons from being vocal on social media and some takeaways that help you transition to speak up on that? I'm going to transition myself. I'm going to go to 3% policy. Supposedly you said that I find it to a policy. But I was really inspired to see you go kind of part of the world to the city.
Yeah, I think before Seguro for Change, I was with Communities for a Better Environment and other EJ organizations as an EJ advocate. So you're right about that. I was doing this work before then. What I found super helpful was I came in an administration that wanted a voice for change inside of government. So even though I had to now, when you're a community member and you serve on a board, when you serve on that board, you have to think for the entire constituency. Same thing from being an advocate to now serving at the city. I can't just think as an advocate. I have to think for the entire city. And I have to build relationships with other city leaders while I build relationships and continue to build relationships with the external environment. So in a way, I'm still an advocate, but I had to reframe the way that I make things happen and the way that I advocate for a broader community, if that makes sense. But I came in, the council was extremely supportive. The mayor was pretty supportive, but hands off. So it gave me the ability to be, innovative in my leadership and innovative in the commissioners that we were able to appoint back then. So I think, and I still am under Mayor Bass. She has been, and her administration has been extremely supportive. And I'm excited that we see eye to eye on so many things. And that we're beginning to have even more discussions about that alignment, and now we can make progress in creating, because the way I see it, what we're doing is we're creating healthier homes. We're not just decarbonizing them, we're creating healthier homes for people to live in. And that's really our goal. And we're creating healthier communities for people. And that's always been my focal point, because I have a master's degree, as you know, in public health. So again, keep your eyes on the prize, keep your eyes on what makes you passionate about your work. This Michelle and Nia said it very well. You have to have an anchor, you have to have an experience that really keeps you focused so that you can get through the really difficult times, because it has been difficult. Even though I think I have support politically, it's been extremely difficult because we have a super small office in comparison to a large department. It's to be that way. We could talk about that another time. But SEMA was supposed to be a department. Some of you may remember that. And then when we came in as a one-person office. Now we're a 5-person office, thankfully, but we're still not a department. And that's okay. I think in some ways we have less hierarchy and less political pushback because we're a smaller office that's more nimble and flexible and can work with other city leaders across the city, because they're like, well, she's not a general manager. She's a thought leader within the city, and we're going to listen to her, so I hope I answered your question.
Yeah.
As well, one of our, start off by saying thank you so much to all of the panelists. It's really interesting. My name is Clara. I've been in UCLA here, so it's nice to hear all of you. I wanted to ask quickly about the kind of geography of heat exposure. Right, there's so many spaces, the home and the transit, occupational spaces, but also, quasi-private third spaces like corner stores, grocery stores, barber shops, etc. And I'm wondering if there are opportunities to come and invest in those kinds of small businesses or municipal businesses and also service, kind of like cooling centers, right? There's one this Chicago we know about, different places. So I'm curious about that. And I also wanted to kind of ask something that CJ had mentioned about cumulative use, right? So folks who are hot at home are also hot getting to work and also hot at work, right? So how do we think about the cumulative effects of being exposed to heat across space and over time, and how does that kind of shape thinking about the vulnerability and the kinds of effects that we make?
So I can comment a little bit on the incentives aspect and when it comes to more informal settings. So in our group, we sort of looked at this, although it was not focused. And I think the primary kind of idea of an informal cooling center is more of a shopping center, a mall, a theater, something like that. But these smaller spaces that you mentioned, like the small businesses that might be on the street or something like that, is not something that we have really looked into. But I will say that our team did have a meeting. I wasn't in the meeting, Corinne was in the meeting with LADWP here in LA. And I believe they did mention that they are looking into how the city can potentially partner with private businesses that are in spaces to sort of establish an MOU model and a little bit, but they were wondering if that was possible to somehow partner with private business entities to maybe allow these spaces to be advertised as quote unquote cooling sites or something like that. And perhaps even figuring out a way to subsidize energy costs for your spaces in order to make sure that they're not being overly burdened as well. So that was just an idea they threw out there, and I think definitely warrants more exploration in terms of how that could look. Sort of a fledgling model to make sure that cooling can reach people where they are and increase access in places that might not be as thought of or kind of like less considered, but definitely help people stay warm.
And then we're launching our Heat Relief for LA campaign May 24th. And part of the long-term goal is to create external alliances, not just with CBOs and nonprofits, but small businesses and maybe not so small businesses like Jack in the Box, McDonald's and Starbucks, who do have not just cooling, they have restrooms, they have water, they have charging stations, and they're mostly empty. I don't know if you ever walked in them, during the pandemic, but they've stayed mostly empty since the heat of the pandemic has ended. So I think they would be great partners. And we've begun to reach out to them. And I hadn't thought about lowering their energy burden or compensating them in any way, but I thought it would be a good neighbor type of request so that they could help people through heat waves. So people can just come in, no questions asked, use, get water, use a restroom, sit down, save lives, because we know from the CDC research and other research that if you are being burdened in every aspect of your life, you really just need 3 or 4 hours of refuge and recovery to make it the next day and the next day and the next day. So people don't need to stay there 24 hours. It's not like if it's a fire or something like you can stay there 3-4 hours and hopefully recover. Now, if you have chronic illness or something else is going on, that may not be the case. But in general, you really only need the refuge for 3 or 4 hours. And we want to make the first and last miles a lot more comfortable too. I think that's part of the strategy. So some of you have seen the UCLA heat risk map. You want to look at that map, look at Helen Bioscreen, overlay it with other health data. And then also first and last mile where transit is most used to ensure that we have canopy, whether it's tree or structure, and that we have places like, these small businesses that can give refuge to folks as they're walking to and from that bus stop or to and from school. I think that is going to create a long-term, more climate heat adapted city. And those are the features that we're talking about, that we're thinking about in terms of planning and design of the city.
Great. And so I think we're just at about time, but maybe I'll give the panelists an opportunity for one final thought if you have it, or one thing that didn't come up that you'd like to add to the conversation. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, this will actually be slightly answering Bharat's question, but, you know, I think maybe my final thought is just thinking across the importance of thinking across people's exposures and thinking about where people spend the most time, home, school, work, outdoor spaces, and thinking about how, you know, we can understand heat and tailor policies across that board. And I really like your point about creatively thinking about third spaces or other spaces where people might spend time as being potential cooling opportunities too. So I think there's there are so many questions in each of these spaces about people's exposure and experiences, and then, you know, lots of opportunities to try to figure out how it all fits together. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, that's great.
I'll end it also by just saying like it would be beneficial to also start looking at like small places, like I mentioned, the San Fernando Valley that, you know, is home to one of the largest private airports, Van Nuys Airport, right? And what's going on with expansions there, what happened with the surrounding spaces there, especially in a predominantly suburban area. In terms of heat, how does the change and the built environment that is now proposed to be, you know, increased for the Van Nuys Airport, that capacity is poised to be increased. What does that look like for a valley that is already experiencing like triple-digit heat, especially moving forward as SEMO and other, you know, leaders are taking on this heat problem? I think would be interesting to look into, but, you know, I'm sure that's going to be for some future researchers out there.
Yeah, I think in terms of the question about thermal version, you know, when there's prolonged exposure, I think that just really comes to a larger scale efforts that are required to help green the city and really transform the built environment and counteract the urban heat island effect. And I think that's sort of like the wide scale thing that I think most of us here are aiming to see. And I think more specifically, when we think about places like the home setting or the school setting, we also want to see policies codified, such as building code requirements that ensure that there is a temperature standard that ensures folks are not exposed to dangerous temperatures in places where they're spending a lot of time. So I think that that's an area that is definitely being pushed on, and there has been legislation proposed for an indoor heating standard for rental units that fortunately have met a lot of pushback from apartment associations and, you know, real estate industry. But that effort is really important, and I think this is where research and advocacy, you know, come together when we really want to see changes codified and changes in the built environment, you know, come to fruition. That's a longer term effort, but I think, you know, research is here to help push that forward, and that's sort of, you know, sort of the end game that we're all keeping in mind as well.
Last thoughts, Marta?
Well, thank you again to everyone. And maybe the flip side of codified is implementation and enforcement. I've witnessed over the last few decades, enforcement has really gone down. Even if we have great policies in place, nobody's there to enforce them. So I would also encourage, and it creates more jobs. So government should be creating more jobs that actually help enforce the good policies that exist, and the future ones that we need.
Yeah, you're here. Great. Please join me in thanking our fabulous panelists and a great conversation. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much.
Great, yeah. Good job, everyone. Good job. Yeah.
I know. How's your mom?
Check on here. Whenever it gets really hot,
Cool.
Maybe not. Oh, okay.